This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 99 is Jungian analyst and professor of psychiatry, Dr. Michael Escamilla in Edinburg, Texas. He graduated cum laude with a bachelor's degree in general studies from Harvard University and received his medical degree from Southwestern Medical School at the University of Texas. He then completed his internship and residency at the University of California, San Francisco, where he was an American Psychiatric Association fellow in psychiatric genetics. Dr. Escamilla later went on to train as a Jungian analyst at the Jung Institute Zürich, where he earned a diploma in analytical psychology in 2013. Currently, he serves as department chair and professor of psychiatry at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley School of Medicine, where his research focuses on the genetics of schizophrenia. He has conducted seminal studies in the genetics of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia in Latino populations, funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, for which he has served as an advisor on psychiatric genetics research. Dr. Escamilla has worked to teach recovery-oriented psychiatric practice across the state of Texas and was the founding director of the Center of Excellence in Neurosciences at Texas Tech University Health Science Center in El Paso. In 2015, he was named the first Macmillan Scholar at the Frank N. Macmillan Jr. Institute for Jungian Studies at the Jung Center in Houston. His role involves coordinating the Fay lectures, editing their book series, and curating and creating content for their website, The Jung Page. His blog posts on David Bowie, the contributions of Tony Wolfe to analytical psychology, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Carl Jung are not to be missed. He has published over 100 journal articles and is the author of the book Bleuler, Jung, and the Creation of the Schizophrenias, published by Diamond Verlag in 2016. His work on Jung in neuroscience is included in the book The Professional Practice of Jungian Coaching, and his chapter on football in the United States appears in Analytical Psychology of Football. Both books were published by Routledge and edited by episode 98 guests John and Nada O'Brien. Please visit the website speakingofjung.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, December 15th, 2021, through the magic of Zoom. Dr. Escamilla, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. Great to be part of this series.
I would like for you to tell us the story of how you got here. You trained to become a medical doctor, then a psychiatrist, and then you spent several years training as a geneticist, specializing in psychiatric diseases, and then you went on to become a Jungian analyst.
That is correct. Yeah. It's, I guess, that's a very sequential way of explaining it. But I think along the way, I had become interested in Jung, and even before medical school. So I think what happened to me, I had a kind of strange path. Mm-hmm. When I was in college, I was very interested in the sciences and very interested in the humanities, in particular literature and poetry and art. And I did not care for psychology at all. I thought it was like this strange field that was, making statements about people and how they are, and I felt it wasn't very scientific, mm-hmm. and it didn't allow for freedom of understanding people that you have, for instance, in the arts. So I really just stayed away from everything to do with psychology. But I was very interested in humanities and science. In the last semester, I think, when I was in college, I took a course on film, and it was specifically film that represented dream states in film, going through a number of really interesting cinematic experiences. Including one of them was a movie about Freud. I think it was an early film about Freud. But during that course, we had to read some theories about dreams. So one of the books we read was a compilation of essays on dreams by Carl Jung. And so that was my first exposure to Jung. And I thought, his ideas were very interesting. And after college, I took a year off. I worked in a genetics lab, and I was trying to figure out if I wanted to go into medicine or into basic science. Mm-hmm. And I used to every once in a while go just walk through the library at the university. I was at the University of Texas working, and I would just sort of randomly pick books off the shelf. And in that process, one of the books I looked into was Jung's Tavistock lectures. So these were these lectures he gave in, I believe it was in London, and I can't remember the exact year, but he kind of went through all his theories, and he was actually presenting to an audience of doctors. So I was really inspired by that book because it actually made a lot of sense to me, his theories. And he goes over, all his ideas, including personality types and what the unconscious is, and how you could use that to help patients. And so I was very inspired by that and decided to go into medical school with the idea of becoming a psychiatrist and doing the kind of stuff Jung was doing. And I just knew him through that book as a psychiatrist, right? So as I went through medical school, the interest in Jung kind of gradually fell by the wayside as I was studying anatomy and physiology and everything else you do as a medical student. But I still was very fascinated with psychiatry, and I think in my third year of medical school, worked in a VA hospital, and the first patient I had was a young man with schizophrenia who just had his first psychotic break. And I was very moved by how severe the illness was, this sudden break with reality and hallucinations and delusions. And I had to talk to his parents about what his diagnosis was. And I realized we as a scientific community really didn't understand what had happened. All we could do was put this label on it as schizophrenia, and then give this prognosis, which was that he was going to have this the rest of his life.
Right.
And so at that point, I got very interested in trying to see if there's a way to understand what causes schizophrenia. And I knew from college that genetics was a way to start to understand diseases, all diseases, including schizophrenia. So to make a long story short, from there, I went on to my psychiatry residency with a focus on learning genetics and using that to try to understand what caused schizophrenia. During residency, I had probably 2 or 3 supervisors who were Jungians, and that was during the part of my training where I was doing psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. So my interest in Jung came back, but I kind of had to keep it on the side as I really dove into the genetics work. many years later, after I had started my career as a scientist and working in a medical school, doing genetic research, an opportunity came up for me to go to Zurich and to go to some classes there. And when I went there, I discovered there was a long distance training in Jungian analysis. So I dove into that, at that point in time. And then I would go back and forth between Zurich studying Jung and then back to my work doing research on schizophrenia. And just sort of held that those two opposites, if you will, for a number of years, and until hopefully I'm starting to integrate them at this point. So that's a long story of how I got to the training institute. But Jung was always there in the back of my mind, I think, since that last semester in college.
The book you're referring to that includes Jung's Tavistock lectures from 1935 is titled Analytical Psychology, Its Theory and Practice, and I will have a link to that in the show notes for this episode. So you said that it was reading Jung's work that had set you on the path to become a psychiatrist. And another thing you point out, which I love, is that a lot of people study Jung's later work on dream interpretation and symbols and the unconscious and individuation and myths, but they overlook his earlier career work on the topic of schizophrenia and the other psychotic illnesses. So, I mean, that's what the first 4 volumes of the collected works, right?
Yeah, I believe so. And a lot of the later works, even like Mysterium Conjunctiosus, you even see, he's writing about schizophrenia and his insights from schizophrenia there. So it's scattered throughout the books, but it's very intensively in those first 4 volumes.
I would like for you to tell us about how Jung's early career work as a physician, as a medical doctor, in that role as MD, Dr. Jung, how that influenced his, what word would you use, formulation of analytical psychology, of how analytical psychology was born from that. So take us through what you discovered.
Okay. So let me see if I can rephrase that. So how did Jung's being a doctor, being a psychiatrist influence his thinking or his way of formulating? Well, I think if you go to some of his own writings, he'll talk about this interesting dream he had when he was in college. He was trying to figure out what he was going to do with his life, and he has a dream where he sees some kind of biological creature, like in a pond, and he interprets that dream as, in a roundabout way, that leads him to medicine, because what he interpreted from that is that he was interested in biology and in the biological aspects of life. Previously he had been, very interested in philosophy as a young student, but there's a biological drive or a desire to understand biology that comes from his own unconscious. And then he goes on to medical school. He's very, and as he goes through medical school, it's not clear what he's going to become. Like he, for all practical purposes, could have become a surgeon or something. He was just interested in understanding the body, the biology of life, and how it is in human beings, which is what doctors focus on. And we focus on when things get out of whack, when people become ill. But then he has sort of another Satori moment when he's in medical school, where he reads a textbook of psychiatry, and I'm blanking on the name right now, but it's Austrian psychiatrist, and there's a passage that really moves him, and basically the passage talks about understanding people in a very complex way, understanding them in terms of not just their biology, but their life experiences, their thoughts, sort of a very comprehensive way of understanding a human being. And he's very excited by that. He talks about, he knows at that moment he wants to be a psychiatrist. So, and I think what he's realizing in that moment is that he can start to combine his interest in philosophy and mainly philosophy, his interest in philosophy with his, the biology and the scientific stuff he was learning. So he goes on, he becomes a psychiatrist. He has an extremely intensive introduction to that. I don't think people appreciate it. I certainly didn't until I read about it. But he went into psychiatry at this hospital called the Burghölzli right outside of Zurich, and that's where he met his mentor. The person who was the director was a doctor named Eugen Bleuler. But he literally lived in that hospital for, I think, about 4, 5, 6 years. I mean, not only did he work every day and every night, right? Because I think it was him, Bleuler, and maybe one other psychiatrist for the whole hospital. But he literally lived there, and Bleuler lived there. Now, when Jung got married, his wife thankfully got him to move outside of the psychiatric hospital. But Bleuler, even with his family, lived there. So it was an incredible immersion into the psychiatry world. And I think he writes that his first year, I don't know how true it is, but that he didn't even leave the hospital. He never left to go out to do anything in the outside world. So he was, really immersed himself, and he read all the texts. There were some journals on psychiatry at that time. It was a relatively new field, but he immersed himself in everything that, was known about psychiatry, at least through the German-speaking world, up to that date. Now, he is working from the beginning with patients who are really, very disabled, right? Because he's in a psychiatric institute. He's not seeing, people who are outpatient, that like we see people in outpatient practices these days, or people who are functioning pretty well but are dealing with depression or anxiety. He's seeing very severely affected individuals. And so he is embedded in that. It's definitely a medical model that was taught to him at the Burghölzli. So the basic understanding, which came from the German founders of that university, was that there's a biological basis to these severe mental illnesses. And they're in the process of trying to understand what that biology is, but it's biological. And they have an understanding by that point that a lot of it has to do with what they call heredity, that it's something that's inherited, because they notice that in particular families you would see multiple cases. So they're trying to figure this out. Jung himself is doing research with brains. He's most of the German-based institutes at that time were doing research, and one of the first things they were looking at was, can you understand this by some abnormalities in the brain? So he's actually, in there in the lab as well. But then he, and they also are combining that biological view with two other currents of thought. One is coming from France, and that's the work of Charcot and some of the other people who are interested in this idea of an unconscious and unconscious processes. And then later, around the same time that Jung starts, they also get interested in Freud's ideas, because Freud is writing about the unconscious. And so all these different currents are coming together, and Jung kind of abandons looking at brains because he comes across the idea of doing scientific experiments using things like the word association test. But he's very medical. He's trying to understand what's driving him is what is causing these patients to have these severe breaks with reality, and to try to help them get better. And he will approach his understanding of the psyche through trying to understand what causes what we now call schizophrenia. And then throughout his life, he will, always talk about he's a doctor, he's a psychiatrist. He was very proud of that, and I think he was many other things, but I think he always had the idea that he was doing his work to help people, and that there was a biological as well as psychological experience going on within us.
Your book, Bleuler, Jung, and the Schizophrenias, was published by Robert Hinshaw at Diamond Verlag in Einsiedeln, Switzerland. I actually got to visit him there in 2015. And yeah, and in that book, you point out that Jung's core ideas for analytical psychology were directly inspired from the work that he did with psychotic patients. And I had never really thought of it that way. There are a few chapters in that book that really stood out to me, and I'd like to just mention them here briefly. One is Jung decides on a career as an alienist. What is an alienist?
Yes, I love that word, and
yeah, me too.
I've thought at times I wanted to get a business card instead of psychiatrist to put alienist.
I love it.
So, well, I mentioned a little earlier that when Jung was starting psychiatry, it was a very new field. Mm-hmm. It had not been around very long. It had, started to be formed in really like the decades right before he started. So initially, initially patients with, well, they weren't even patients, but people with severe psychotic symptoms or, breaks with reality, they were basically warehoused in prisons. And then at some point, thanks to the Age of Enlightenment and ideas around that, doctors started to try to help these folks, but they had there was no such thing as psychiatry. So there's no starting point. Mm-hmm. And so a doctor who worked with patients with these severe illnesses was called an alienist. And where that comes from, my understanding of it is that they were working with people who were, quote unquote, alienated from society and alienated from themselves. And so an alienist was someone who could help someone who was in that state. And so that's that's technically what Jung was becoming at that time. And that evolved into the field of psychiatry.
Another chapter that stood out to me is Symbols of Transformation. Jung presents a revised psychology of the unconscious.
So his first book had came out around 1906, and it was called, in English, it would be something like The Psychology of Dementia Praecox. And dementia praecox was a word for a severe psychotic illness that had a sort of like a dementia process that would affect people early in life. And that was the word that was coined by a German psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin. That later becomes, in the United States and really the rest of the world, it gets replaced with the word schizophrenia. And that word came from Bleuler. When Bleuler was looking at the same type of patients Kraepelin was looking at, but he came out with a very different conceptualization, and then created his own. Both of them had neologisms, right? Neologisms are when you make up a word that hasn't been in existence before, and it's a common feature of schizophrenia. But interestingly, both Kraepelin and Bleuler came up with neologisms, the words dementia praecox, the word schizophrenia. At any rate, so Jung's first book was about those patients with dementia praecox, what we would now consider schizophrenia, and understanding them from a psychological standpoint. So the 1911, 1912 book, Symbols of Transformation, what he's doing there, I think it has, I think there's other translations of it that have different titles, but that's probably the closest to the German. What he's doing there is he is looking, he had done about 4 or 5 years of work with Freud by that point, and they had started this International Association of Psychoanalysis. And he, in the Symbols of Transformation, he's presenting a different way of thinking about the unconscious than Freud had. So he's kind of presenting an alternative theory of the unconscious. In that earlier book, on the psychology of dementia praecox, he's using a lot of Freud's ideas to understand the psychology of what's going on. But in 1911, 1912, he's really making a break from Freud and coming up with some new ideas, some new concepts that Freud didn't have and didn't agree with.
The other section of the book that stood out to me is titled Jung's Red Book, The Influence of the Psychoses. What role did Jung's experiences in psychiatry at the Berg-Hulsey play in his writing? You know, his writing in the Black Books that later became the Red Book? Yes.
I think they played an incredible role, and it's fascinating to me. I know I've had I had at least one prominent Jungian scholar that disagrees with me on this, but I don't see how you can ignore it. When he was working with these his patients in the Berg-Hulsey, so there's a couple of cases that stand out. One of them is in that book, The Psychology of Dementia Praecox. He goes into great detail about one particular case, and it's a woman there that has, I guess, what we would call a diagnosis of schizophrenia now. But what he learned from Bleuler, who really was his main mentor, more so than Freud. What he learned from Bleuler was when you had someone with schizophrenia, it might seem like everything they're saying makes no sense, unintelligible, both their verbal behaviors and their physical behaviors. Mm-hmm. But if you really, really work with them, talk to them, stick with it, you can start to understand what's going on underneath the surface from a psychological perspective. So, and Jung, when Freud goes to visit Jung at the Berg-Hulsey, he wants to meet this woman that Jung had written so much about And after Freud meets the woman, he's like, how can you spend so much time with a person like that? Because she was, really out of it and really psychotic. And Freud didn't have experience of working with patients like that. So that shows you how much, Jung was able to relate to and put himself in the frame of mind of his patients. And he learned that from Bleuler, because that was Bleuler's whole idea. If you live and work with these folks, you'll start to understand them. So in that process, I guess around 1909, around that time, both Jung and Freud start getting into looking at the idea of complexes, which are the psychological complexes, and they're looking at how they manifest themselves in culture, like in mythologies, for instance. And at some point, Jung has a very difficult time around 1911, 1912. He leaves the Bergholzli, and we're not sure exactly why. He says it was just that he couldn't do, the work had become so difficult at that hospital, the day-to-day work of being a doctor there, that he couldn't write and do his other things. But we also know there were some scandals going on that might have forced him out. But he leaves the Bergholzli, and he had, up till then, his path had been to be a university professor, in the medical school there. But he leaves that to go into, I guess, what we would call private practice. And he also publishes this book, The Symbols of Transformation, where he breaks from Freud. And Freud is pretty upset about it and kind of, eventually breaks with him. So he's lost all his moorings. And he's also, as I mentioned, he would really get into what is going on in his patients' minds. So around that time, he has this sudden, you could say, a depression coming on, maybe a midlife crisis, because he's sort of lost his moorings of his career and his main professional connections. But he is also very fascinated with the rich inner world of his patients. And he has this moment where he basically says his patients have a myth, or they have myths that they live by and that motivate them, and he doesn't have his own myth. So it's really a poignant, I think it's also, you could maybe find it in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. But it's poignant because he is, the doctor who's been helping these patients with disorders, and he suddenly has this shift where they have a richer inner world and a more meaningful inner world than he does. And he starts to look for his own myth. And that's how the Red Book starts. So it came, really did come from, in my view, from his exposure to the patients, realizing that there was something in their inner world that was very powerful and profound, and that the outer world, the scientific world, medical world that he was in, didn't have that same meaning. So I think that's, there's another book he reads around that time by a patient named Schreiber, Daniel Schreiber. And Schreiber is this person who publishes a book about, he's deeply embedded in his own psychoses, but he just puts it all out there. And again, Jung was very influenced and excited by the depth of this person's thought and his ideas. And by comparison, Freud thought the guy was just nuts. And that was another break between the two of them, I think, between Jung and Freud.
I'd like to circle back to something you mentioned about Freud. Freud was not a psychiatrist. He was a neurologist. So he did not have the exposure that Jung had to these mental states. So
Correct.
they really were not coming from the same place. And I like also how much you point out in your book that it was Bleuler who was Jung's real mentor and not Freud.
Yes, absolutely. It's completely obscured, but historically, but that it's very much the case. So Bleuler, let's see, Bleuler. I've already mentioned how his approach to working with patients, actually living in the hospitals there, and he would eat meals with patients, and so
you know what that reminds me of? I really want to mention this.
Okay.
I used to watch this television show, and I was going to bring this up in a little bit when we talk about your chapter on neuroscience and Jung. I used to watch this television show called Northern Exposure.
I've heard of it. Yeah, I've seen an episode or two.
Some episodes. Yeah, there were 6 seasons. It aired in the 1990s on CBS. And
it was a doctor up in Alaska, right?
Yes.
Working in Alaska.
Yes. And one of the characters wanted to become, or felt that he was called to become, a shaman. And so when he was training to become a shaman, what the shaman that he was studying under did was show him how, in order to help someone or heal someone, you need to live with them for a few days. And that always stood out to me, because isn't that true? You don't really know someone until you live with them and you watch all of their routines and just how they structure their day and their night and everything.
Yeah.
It just reminds me of that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'd like to cover the neuroscience and the genetics aspect. So maybe we should, I'm sorry, I'm belaboring the point on Bleuler. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll do a couple of points on Bleuler. Yeah. So we've seen how his method and, of working with patients and how that influenced Jung. And, the other thing to just keep in mind is that both of them were working with patients with psychoses, psychotic disorders. And that's something Freud didn't have any contact with in his own practice as a neurologist. But Bleuler was really interested in all these different ways of understanding his patients. And I mentioned that at the Bergholzli, they combined the German biological approach with the French ideas about an unconscious, and then with Freud's ideas. And so Bleuler has a whole understanding of the unconscious and how the unconscious works. And it's built on the idea of complexes. And he puts that together with Jung. So the two of them are working together to understand the unconscious from a scientific perspective. And they wrote a number of articles. There's a couple of books where there's chapters by Bleuler and by Jung. So they really developed a whole way of understanding the unconscious, which is separate from Freud. It doesn't involve the drive theories or, the two main, like the Oedipal complex, for instance. Freud puts everything in that one complex. Bleuler and Jung look at each person as having many, many different complexes, and they really understand that people are a composite of these formative life experiences and the associations from them. And, they weren't able to study the brain directly, but they're really understanding the brain psychologically as a number of complexes, a number of that we are our memories and the associations of those memories, and those influence us. So Jung really learned from Bleuler and how to understand these very difficult psychotic states, but they also were very interested in, everyday psychology. What makes everyone tick, not just people with illnesses. So it's really interesting, no one reads like Bleuler wrote a really interesting book around 1906 that came out the same time Jung's first book did. And it talks about, day-to-day life and how the unconscious is active and what are the components of the unconscious. And so Bleuler was really, really important mentor. And there's very late writings of Jung. Well, he'll talk about his mentor, and his mentor, he'll say, was Bleuler. So
his mentor was Bleuler. Yeah. So again, the book is titled Bleuler, Jung, and the Schizophrenias. It was published in 2016, and there will be a link to that in the show notes for this episode. And now I would like to move on to talk a little bit about neuroscience. And I was very excited preparing for this episode because my background is in neuroscience. I studied it in college, and then I worked in the field in a hospital setting, in a research hospital. So I was really excited to read your work linking neuroscience and Jung, and I unfortunately have been kicking myself for the past few weeks for deciding to leave that field because I thought it was necessary. So in the book, The Professional Practice of Jungian Coaching, which was edited by John and Nada O'Brien, who were my guests in the previous episode, episode 98, your chapter titled Neuroscience and Jung was published. In it, you say that modern neuroscience, present day neuroscience, is just now catching up to Jung's ideas.
Yes, but I should explain that a little bit. At the time when Jung was coming up with his theories, we just had the very, very rudimentary ways of understanding the brain. And it was really just looking at the brain, physically. Mm-hmm. We didn't have imaging. We really didn't have EEGs either, which is a way to measure like the neural activity in the brain. And so he was using these things like, he was measuring electrical activity, but measuring it from the hands and things like that. So when I say that, neuroscience is catching up to Jung's ideas, what I mean by that is that we can now start to test out Jung's ideas using neuroscience tools. The other thing that I mean by that is that as neuroscientists are starting to understand the brain and how that interacts with our psychological experience, they are coming up with concepts that are, for all practical purposes, it maps onto Jung's idea of complexes, and also, different thought processes. And in Symbols of Transformation, one of the big things Jung is writing about is that there's two ways of thinking. There's a sort of rational, logical way of thinking, and then there's a more symbolic, poetic, artistic way of thinking. Mm-hmm. Two different ways that the brain processes information. And now with neuroscience, we actually see that there are different states, different circuits that are involved when a person's doing an activity versus not doing an activity, when they're in a dream state. So there's an understanding now that the brain is not just, a logical apparatus, like just a computer doing logical work, but that there are these different modalities of thought, and they're going on for all practical purposes simultaneously in our brain. And that's something that Jung, was talking about. He was talking about complexes and how our personalities formed by the complexes. And neuroscience is starting to see these things. Now, it's not using any of the Jungian terminology.
Mm-hmm.
So it's come about it through a different path. And in that chapter, I talk about there's different, psychologists use different words. They don't even like the word unconscious, current psychologist and, doing experimental psychology. You won't find that word.
It's such a big pet peeve of mine. So why is that? I mean, how can you do anything without taking into consideration the unconscious? Just
right. Well, they take it into consideration, but they just don't like that word and they don't like what it represents. I think it's just a reaction to, this is a cultural thing that happened,
mm-hmm.
Over the last century, but and I can talk about it more from the medical world, but I think it also was probably happening some in the psychology world. But a lot of neuroscience comes from the medical world, right? So in the medical world, the initial ways of understanding the mind and the brain were very focused on the logical side of the brain, logical side of thinking. And, the word association experiment, for instance, was developed to try to understand how we make associations in the brain. And they weren't there was no idea of an unconscious, really. So then you have these radical thinkers, Jung and Freud, talking about this thing called the unconscious. And I think there's just a reaction in medicine against that because, for the medical model is very interested in logic, and it's, logically defining this is a disease and this isn't. This is the treatment. This isn't. And it really has trouble with understanding the complexity of psychology and the idea of spectrums from illness to health. The medical model doesn't like that. So the unconscious sort of was, it got into American medicine when a number of analysts emigrated to the States after World War II. And there were a lot of people, there was a lot of war trauma and, what we would now call PTSD. And at that point, there was a big swing in academia in the medical schools to have people with this Freudian-based approach treating patients. But people, and there was a counter push to that. Started with Aaron Beck, who recently passed away, but developing the cognitive behavioral approaches to therapy. There was a frustration with the Freudian approach, and the Freudian approach is based on the unconscious, right? But in my view, a very limited way of looking at the unconscious. So the people in the medical schools or the psychology schools who didn't like that sort of vagueness, the long extended analysis, it wasn't very medically oriented. There was that swing back to CBT and understanding brain functioning, not using these to them almost like mystical or messy terms like the unconscious. So they'll talk about implicit memory. So that's like a word that is they break what we consider the unconscious as Jungians. They break it into the components of what does that mean. So there's declarative memory, And then there's implicit memory. Declarative is something you can, recall and you can put into words. Implicit is something that you can't recall, and memory that's maybe not based on words. So I think they wanted a more scientific way of talking about the same phenomenon that we talk about when we use the word unconscious. And to give them some credit, I think there's a lot to be said for that, because when we talk about the unconscious as Jungians, it can be pretty vague. It can get vague, and if you're trying to understand these things scientifically, which I think there's a value to doing that, you need to define the terms better. And so I think that's why there's that split right now. And then the Jungians they never really got into the medical schools. It was the Freudians who, became the department chairs and things like that. And then they, so all the reaction to, let's say, analytic psychology just got thrown in there with the Freudian views. And they were all just sort of rejected over the last 30 or 40 years in academia.
Do you see that changing now?
Well, I wish I could be more optimistic, but I don't see it unless it's going to take a lot of, it's going to take individuals getting in there and really pushing it. I think Jungians are still, very scarce in academia, it's just an unfortunate situation that as the Jungian movement, or however you want to call it, as it developed, it was really focused on Jungian institutes, which were freestanding and outside of the university. And so, the few Jungians that are in the university setting are, far and few between. I can only think of a handful. I can think of some that are, have kind of adjunct appointments. So they're able to teach and hopefully get some of the Jungian thoughts in there, but it's
well, what about your ongoing project in Texas where you are teaching Jungian ideas to students? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I guess, I can definitely talk about that. So it is, it has been a bit of a struggle, and sometimes things work out well. So there's some synchronicity and some positive experiences, serendipity that have helped me to be able to do that. But so I think for me, one thing that helped was when I was at the Health Science Center in San Antonio, was running my psychiatry genetics research lab. There was a psychiatrist. Her name was Mary Ware. She was a psychiatrist who had gone through training in San Antonio and had been very influenced by Jung, because there was a professor there at the time in the psychiatry department who was a Jungian. And when Mary Ware passed away, in her will, she left some money for the school to create a position in psychiatry for someone to teach Jung. So I was really lucky at that point, because that opportunity came up for our department, and the department chair I had at the time, even though he didn't know I was interested in Jung, but he connected me up with that. And he said, well, Mike, you're interested in genetics. And, I seem to recall Jung had this idea of, the personality types, that those were inborn, and maybe you could do something in this area. And I just jumped at it. So I was able to start to study Jung and actually trained to become an analyst while I was in academia. And I had this great opportunity to teach Jung in that particular medical school. So that's, all good luck, right? I mean, it just came out of the blue, really. Although I had that predecessor in that school of, I'm blanking on his name now, but there was a.
Was it Charles Bowden?
Well, Charles Bowden was my chair, but he was very biological, but before him, there was. I'll try to look it up afterwards and get the name to you. But there was a psychiatrist there who was a Jungian. He'd studied with. I think he actually, trained a bit with Jung himself. But so he had done some teaching to medical students and psychiatry residents about Jung. And there's actually a book called Practical Jung that he wrote, which is based on how he taught Jung to medical students and residents. So that's a really good resource. It's also published by Diamond Verlag. So there was a little there. That was just an interesting roundabout story that got Jung into that school. And so then I was able to start, having annual lectures and inviting speakers to teach about Jung. So from there, then I was able to run this Neuroscience Institute in El Paso. I moved on to do that work. And as the director, I had some leeway of being able to decide some of the research we were doing. So I was able to fund through that a study looking at using neuroscience and functional magnetic resonance imaging to look at what's going on in the brain when complexes are generated.
So what is going on in the brain when complexes are generated? Tell us briefly, if you would.
Okay. It's fascinating. So when I first started this, I was working with a neurosurgeon named Philip Bechtel, and his question was, can we see complexes in the brain? Is there any evidence at all that the brain reacts differently when complexes are triggered? So we're kind of going into it with a blank slate. Like, let's test this hypothesis from the start. And so what we did find, and it's a very complicated way we had to do it, using the word association test and figuring out certain words that trigger complexes in certain people, and then words that are neutral. And we looked at the brain and how does the brain respond? And then we had to subtract the differences between when it's reacting to a neutral word versus a complex word. But the upshot of it was we found two brain circuits that get really activated when a complex is triggered. And one of the circuits, and we wrote a paper about this, it's published in the Journal of Analytical Psychology. But one of the circuits is, we call it like the memory body circuit. So it's parts of the brain that are involved in memories and where memories are encoded. And then it goes directly to the motor cortex. So the parts of the brain that both send messages to the body and receive messages from the body. So you could think of this as a nonverbal response to a complex that's in the body, if you will. The second circuit that gets activated is much more complex. So it doesn't go through that, to the motor complex. It goes from the part of the brain that encodes memories. It also goes to the some of the deeper limbic structures where emotion is generated, and then also to parts of the brain where meaning is ascribed, and also where symbols and words are. So
what do you call that one?
many words. We call that, I guess, memory, language, meaning circuit, right?
Okay.
So now complexes can probably be stimulated by things other than words, right? So this might have to do with the fact that we were doing the word association test to trigger the complexes. But certainly when a complex is triggered by a word, it activates a part of the brain that wants to associate that in language and come up with meanings. And it's like, you can think of it as a survival mechanism. Think of it as, when we've had really deep experiences that affected us in a very negative or very positive way, the brain wants to remember that because it's useful. Let's just say something bad happened to you, something traumatic. The brain wants to remember that. So if you're in any situation that has anything to do with that, it triggers you that you're in a difficult situation. And so it can, so that first circuit, it triggers you, it just goes to the body. It just alerts you that something's going on. Be ready to move, be ready to run, flee, whatever. But the second path is it starts to try to figure out the memory and the words associated with it, and then the thoughts and the associations that are in the brain. And so it's another survival mechanism, if you will, to use your the part of your brain that uses language to try to figure out why you're feeling the way you're feeling. So I think that's kind of what's going on. It's pretty fascinating. It's pretty dramatic too. Besides the fMRI, we were able to do some studies using EEGs. And again, there's just a lot of activation in, especially the frontal cortex really gets worked up. That's the part of the brain that initiates movements and initiates activities and kind of tells. It's like the command structure in the brain, tells you what to do, and so that part gets really activated. And then also the temporal cortex, where our thoughts and words and emotions can be.
You said that when you were doing these studies, these experiments, you had to issue trigger words to your subjects, but obviously, or maybe not obvious to some people, not the same words could be used on everybody. It depended on someone's complexes.
Absolutely.
So,
and that goes back to Bleuler, right? The way he understood human beings was that each person has a large number of complexes that are unique to them. They're unique to their history and their experience. So that's why you can't treat a person, you can't help a person as a psychiatrist or therapist without knowing the very unique story of the person and the complexes that complete them. So absolutely. So we used the word association test before we did the imaging. We did the word association test. We used a way we do it in Zurich. It's where you give them 100 words. You just read the words and they respond with the first thing that comes to their mind. And you measure the reactions to each word. And so there are certain words that they just answer something back very quickly. And then there are other words where they get stuck. They don't, there's a time delay, or they have, they flinch, or you can see a body movement. So we would call those the complex indicators. So for each person, they would have a list of 100 words, and we would figure out for each person, 5 words that triggered complexes. And we didn't go into the details of it, like why these words might have done it. But we knew from those experiments, we knew which words triggered complexes in each person. So you're completely right. The complexes are, specific to the individuals.
We haven't really spoken much about your research as a geneticist. Would you tell us a little bit about the work you're doing in that area?
Sure. That's a whole another fascinating area of science right now. So, so the two main disorders I've studied, or illnesses, however you want to call it, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And the reason I studied those is when you look at different psychiatric diagnoses, those two have a very strong genetic component. And there's different ways to figure that out. You know, there's twin studies, adoption studies, and then there's more sophisticated ways where you can look at family structures and you can see for any illness how much of it is genetic versus environmental. So schizophrenia and bipolar have a very strong genetic component. This was realized by Bleuler and Kraepelin way back 100 years ago, and they were completely right. So the main risk for schizophrenia is if you have a family history of it. Same thing for bipolar. Other things in the environment are like minuscule in terms of, anything we have identified that can contribute to those. So we know it's genetic. So myself and many other scientists around the world for the last 20 years or so, maybe 30 years, have been trying to find the genes that are involved in schizophrenia or bipolar. This is the same way, for instance, with Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis. The medical field used genetics and this process called gene mapping, where you study families where there's multiple cases, and you look at the DNA, and you can find the genes that cause the illness. Something like cystic fibrosis, it turns out it's one gene, and there's different mutations or variations in that gene that lead to the illness. Schizophrenia and bipolar, it turns out, are what we call complex genetic disorders, where there are many, many different genes that contribute to the risk. It's not just one gene. So it was over the last 20 years, it's been a lot of learning that's happened in my own lab and then in other people's research. We first realized there wasn't just one gene causing these, and then we had to come up with different techniques of how do we find these genes, because the family-based approaches that worked for Huntington's or cystic fibrosis don't work so well when it's complex genetics. So over the last, I'd say 10 years, the field was finally able to make some breakthroughs by studying really large numbers of subjects with schizophrenia and then control subjects, so people without. Mm-hmm. And when I say large samples, I'm talking like, tens of thousands of cases and controls. So it's a really massive endeavor to do that, but it's borne a lot of fruit. So in my own lab, I've discovered several genes that are associated with schizophrenia and bipolar, but at the world level, I think we're probably over 100 genes now that we've been able to identify that are part of the biology of schizophrenia.
Once this has been discovered and confirmed, what then can be done about it?
Good question. That's, from the beginning, I think the hope, there were lots of different things we thought we would be able to do once we get there and understand the genes. And we're in the process of all of them. So one of them is, once you know which gene variants contribute to these illnesses, you can test someone before they've developed any illness, and you can better identify who's at risk for the disorder. And so we use these complicated equations, but it's called a polygenetic risk score. Mm-hmm. So it's looking at all these, basically for each person, how many of these variants that put you at risk for schizophrenia do you have? And so you could classify, theoretically, you could do this with children. You could say this child's at very high risk, this child's at very low risk. Once you have that, you can actually start to do some studies. If you know who the high risk kids are, you can do studies to see if are there any interventions you can do to prevent schizophrenia. Because we know there's an environmental factor that in conjunction with the genetic risk, that's what causes the disease. So, for instance, I've developed some studies where we identify kids that are high risk for bipolar or schizophrenia, and we have materials to teach them at a really young age about mental illness, mm-hmm. And what are the first signs of it. We work with their parents because it's known that if you can get someone in treatment very early, when they first have their first mania or psychosis, their outcome is going to be much, much better.
Okay.
In reality, like with bipolar disorder, in our studies, we found that it's an average of 5 to 6 years between the first episode and the first time they get diagnosed. So you can see, and both of these illnesses start like in the teenage years or early 20s. So you can imagine if someone has, let's say they have psychosis that starts at 19, if it's untreated, it's going to mess up, their college, mm-hmm. Their work experiences, etc. And if you aggressively work with them at this early stage, you can actually avoid a lot of the downside of the illness. So that's one thing. The other is, as I mentioned, there's like a lot of genes involved. We haven't gotten too far along this line, but I think we will eventually. From one person to another with schizophrenia, what's causing their schizophrenia is can be different clusters or different genes. And based on which genes are involved, we could use medications that are more tailored for that particular pathway. So, or not use medications. So for instance, out of those 100 or so genes that cause schizophrenia, some of them do involve pathways with the dopamine system, which can be treated with antipsychotics that block dopamine. But a lot of the genes are involved in neural formation. So, if you treat that person with a dopamine blocker, you're mainly just giving them side effects and not really treating the cause of the illness. So there's the hope, I think, that using this genetic information, we can tailor the treatments better. And we can, let's say one person, the pathway that's affecting them has to do with how they process information. We can use psychological tools to kind of help them process information better. And another person, it might be their dopamine system's out of whack, and we need to address that with a medication that blocks dopamine. So that's how it can help. Now, some people jump to conclusions like, we could just eliminate the disorders, get rid of the mutations or the polymorphisms that cause this risk. But I'm really adamantly against that, because I think these are all of these variations that in a particular person can add up to schizophrenia. In the general population, they're floating around and they're in a lot of us. Mm-hmm. And we actually know now through some interesting studies that creativity, the same genes that contribute to schizophrenia, also contribute to creativity. And so you don't want to get rid of them in the population, because they have a function, and they they have a positive side to them. But again, one particular individual can get ill because of, whatever combination of those are that they're carrying, plus something in the environment that brought out the illness. So, yeah. So better diagnosis, better, hopefully being able to prevent the illness in those who are at risk.
Mm-hmm.
And wouldn't it be great if, we could identify someone at risk and we could kind of give them advice to let them be creative rather than going into a psychosis.
Mm-hmm. What about Jung's view that schizophrenia was caused by a lowering of mental functioning?
Yeah.
That allowed the unconscious material from the unconscious to more easily manifest. So
yeah, I think he was right. I think it makes sense. So yeah, he
how could you prevent something like that in someone?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, there's lots of different pathways to the ultimate disease of schizophrenia. So there are certain people that most likely the genetic basis of their form of schizophrenia is, has to do with neural connections and how the brain wired as it was growing. So in that case, you can get these things where affect or emotions and cognitions, so thoughts and feelings, aren't integrated very well in the brain. And that can lead to the psychological experience of the ego isn't very strong, to use a psychological word, right? So the ego gets overpowered because it's not strong enough to navigate this very confusing information that's coming in. So if you think of us as like, we're a number of complexes, and one of our complexes is the ego, which, involves that frontal cortex. If that gets weak, which it can be weakened by a number of things, by neural connections, by brain damage, other, certain infections, right, can also cause problems there. So once that gets damaged, the ego, if you think about it psychologically, the ego is weaker. So yeah, you can still treat, but the way to treat, and what Jung said, and some later Jungians who have worked with schizophrenic patients, what they say is you try to help integrate emotion and cognition. So you go to that core problem that's leading to the ego being overwhelmed. The ego's overwhelmed because it doesn't know how to process the information. So in the therapy, you help put feelings to the thoughts. You help to identify the complexes. So it's not just a confusing experience. You tie it to their life story, and that's the way you help them compensate. And Jung will write in his text, he'll say, every patient, he tries to, can't remember how he says it, but he tries to teach them some psychology, meaning to teach them a little bit about their complexes and what they are. And so that's how you can go about doing that. But I think it's true. I mean, I do think the ego, and this is what neuroscientists are starting to put together from the brain perspective what the ego means, right? But so that's one of the splits between neuroscience and psychology, or at least Jungian psychology, is that it's hard to define the ego biologically, but it does exist psychologically, and there's a biology to it.
And there's a biology to it. And then I just want to add this about schizophrenia and Jung. that he correlated introversion with schizophrenia and that it might be an extreme version of introversion.
Right.
And so let's talk about the personality types. I know we're on an hour and 23 minutes here, but there's just too much material to cover. So as Jimmy Church would say, we're going into overtime here, folks.
That's
okay. So personality types and DNA.
Okay. So there's a lot of theories on personality. Probably the one we're all familiar with as Jungians is his idea of different personality types. Introverted, extroverted, and then a strong or weak sensation function, feeling function, thinking function, and sensation, right? Or anyway, so there's Jung. Jung had his theory of different personality types. And really what his theory was about was different functions of personality that can be stronger or weaker in a person. There's other theories of personality out there, like this thing called the 5-factor scale, which it uses introversion, extroversion as one of its factors in personality. But basically, genetics, what we've now been able to show is that these are under genetic control. There's some environmental part of it, but they're also under genetics. So it's true that a child is born with its genetic profile, which is going to largely play a role in their personality, what type of personality they have. And we've been able to now start to map and identify, not quite at the gene level, but we've identified regions of DNA that contain, the genes that influence personality, and including introversion and extroversion. So if anything's genetic, it's coming from the genes, from the DNA. And so if you know that personality, a large component of it is genetic, that means that there are specific genes in our DNA that within a gene, there's always variation in the human species. And so, but a specific gene, if it has it, there's only a certain number of genes that influence personality out of the 30,000 genes, right? Just like schizophrenia, there's only a certain number of genes that influence schizophrenia. So we can, just like with finding genes for disease, we can find genes for traits, and personality is a trait.
And so did Jung see that? I mean, obviously there was no genetic research during Jung's time, right? So he didn't have access to that data, but he thought that we were born with a blueprint.
Yeah. So he was right. He developed the personality theory because he couldn't understand between himself and Freud and one of the other early analysts, they had such different ways of viewing the world that
Adler.
That he wanted Adler, right? He wanted to understand, how can we have such different fixed ways of experience? So that's what drove him to come up with his psychology of personality. But he thought these were inborn, right? There were introverts, there were extroverts, to talk about that particular one. And he did think that people with schizophrenia were very highly introverted, and that those two things went together. So people who are interested in what's going on in their inner world as opposed to the outer world, that was for Jung an introvert, and he thought that's what was going on in schizophrenia. Now, Bleuler, he used the word autism to describe that same phenomenon. So he actually invented the word autism too, but not just schizophrenia. But he said that people with schizophrenia had they had what he called autism. It's not the way we use autism now, but that they were, in their inner world, focused on the inner world. So he used a different word, right, than Jung used introversion. And then it got even more complicated when Freud got it, tried to understand schizophrenia, and he explained it as autoeroticism. The psychological apparatus hadn't gone beyond the very infantile stage of what he called autoeroticism. So they all use different terms to explain what they were observing, that a lot of patients with schizophrenia seem pretty withdrawn, not interacting as much with the outer world and more interested in the inner world. And that has Jung was partly right, partly not right. When we did a study, I haven't published it yet, but we did a study looking at introversion, and we looked at people with bipolar disorder, people who had psychosis, and people who didn't have psychosis. And we did ultimately find that the ones with psychosis overall were more introverted. So there is something to that psychosis and introversion go together. But there were people with psychosis that were extroverted, and there were people without psychosis who were introverted. So it's not just a one-to-one designation, but in general, you could say that introversion and psychosis, there's an association there.
An association. And then one last thing on this subject, in your chapter on neuroscience and Jung, you point out that Jung saw DNA as the natural biological vehicle in which archetypes would need to be transmitted as DNA codes for all of our brain and body structures, and is inherited from our ancestors.
Yes. So there is an interesting film interview with Jung. I think it's called the Houston Interviews, late in his career. And you can, if you go through there, you can find a little section where he actually mentions DNA, because DNA had, become a hot topic around 1959, 1960.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in here. Yeah, I did find that. It is
good.
The Houston films, these transcript of the Houston films is in the book C.G. Jung Speaking, and I will provide a link to that in the show notes. Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, he talks in there, he actually uses the word DNA, and he's talking about archetypes, I believe, which that's a whole nother topic of archetypes, but he's saying the archetypes are in the DNA. And that has to, remember, Jung was a biologist, right? That if you go back to that first dream that got him into med school, he was interested in biology. So for him, archetypes aren't just free floating out there in the world. They are embedded in our biology. And the way that the brain is going to react to the environment, that's coded in our genes. So the whole interplay of how we experience the world, both in terms of our neurology, but our psychology, is embedded in that DNA. And what he would say is that we experience reality in a certain number of common ways that are common across all humans and all cultures. And that's what archetypes are. It's embedded ways of experiencing the world. So it's not just, how should I say? It's not just pictures or images, although you can use them to flesh out an archetype, but they're biological ways that we experience. We're all we have a built-in way of experiencing a mother. We all have a mother complex, but the mother complex is built on the mother archetype that's in our DNA. You could think of it as the biological pattern of how we're going to experience people in our lives. And that's just built into the human race.
I'd like for you to tell us about being the Macmillan Scholar. So that role belonged to Dr. David Rosen, who was a guest on this podcast a few months ago. And when he was it wasn't called the Macmillan Scholar at the time, but it's called the Macmillan Scholar now, with the formation of the Macmillan Institute for Jungian Studies, which is now at the Jung Center in Houston. It's just called the Jung Center. It is in Houston, Texas. And so I was wondering if you would please tell us about your role and what's going on with that today and how it's different from when Dr. Rosen held the position.
Yeah. David Rosen is one of my mentors, and I really learned a lot from him. We connected initially because he was the Macmillan Scholar at Texas A&M, where he was teaching Jung in that university and doing research as well. And then I had gotten this position. It was called the Mary Ware Professorship, teaching Jung in San Antonio. And so I invited him to come do a lecture. So that's where I met him. And then he's just been a mentor ever since. His work is amazing. And he did such great stuff there. So he was actually teaching classes to students at Texas A&M, undergraduates and graduate students as part of the Macmillan professorship back then. But when it transferred so he retired, and then the school, for whatever reason, decided it didn't want to continue that position. Mm-hmm. And so it transformed over to the Jung Center, where I became the first Macmillan Scholar. So it's not affiliated with the university. So we're, and it's, the Jung Center in Houston is really, it really just provides education to anyone who's interested in Jung. It doesn't have their own training programs. It doesn't do research. It's not a university. So the Macmillan Scholar position had to, it had to adapt to that environment. So what the Macmillan Scholar does, we continue one thing in common between when it was at A&M. And that's, we have an annual speaker. It's called the Fay Lecture Series, where we have a prominent Jungian analyst come and speak about a certain topic. And then that, it happens over like a 3-day weekend once a year. And then that comes out as a book that gets published eventually. So there's a long history of these books. They're all published by Texas A&M Press, and we continue that relationship. So I help in putting those together and editing those books. And that's probably my main role as the Macmillan Scholar. But I do some teaching there as well. And I write a little blog that's on this thing called the Jung page, which is that Jung page is, it's basically at the Jung Center. That's where it's maintained right now.
Well, it's a fantastic blog, and I mentioned 3 of your posts in the intro to this episode, but you have others as well, one on Marion Woodman, also one on Jung in the 21st century. And the one on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Carl Jung. I did not know that Jung's photo was on the cover of the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Neither did a lot of our listeners who messaged me after seeing after seeing me post a photo of that album cover in my Instagram stories. I received a lot of messages from people shocked because they didn't know. So I'll provide a link to your blog post. There's just not enough time to cover it here today, but if you would like to know the story behind it, read Dr. Escamilla's blog post.
Yes, it's very interesting.
It's a wonderful blog post. You cover so much, so many topics in that post, the collective unconscious and the four members of the Beatles, which are reminding me of BTS. And you talk about persona.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Just to finish up what you were mentioning about the Fay Lecture Series, this year's speaker, Dr. Nancy Swift Ferlotti, was my guest in episode 94, which was recorded in October. She delivered the Fay Lectures in November. I also did an episode with Frank N. McMillan III in episode 91 about his father, who wrote a book called Finding Jung and also created the Macmillan Institute for Jungian Studies, which is funding all this, is making all of this happen. It's just wonderful what he set up as his legacy. And then, of course, Dr. David Rosen was my guest in episode 93. That is a very popular episode. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off about Sgt. Pepper's, but if there's something you wanted to mention as we wrap up here, please feel free.
Yeah, no. I think I also love music. I play music, and I'm a big Beatles fan. So that was a fun article for me to write. But at that time, that was 1967, and they were like the major group. That a lot of people say that in the rock world, that's, the when they rate best albums of all time, it's up there at the top. But they wanted to put who they thought the most influential people in our culture were at that time. And so you can read that article to see why Carl Jung is up there. But yeah, it does reflect on BTS, and recently they titled an album Map of the Soul, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Persona.
So it's interesting that Jung, he's definitely in popular culture back then. 67 was just a few years after he died, and he was on the cover of Time magazine, also, like in around late in his life. So, Jung has so much to say about our culture and who we are as humans. So. Makes sense that he would be on that. Yeah, read Jung. I agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. And I know we covered a lot. I had a lot of distractions. There was a lot of noise. I'd like to tell the listeners I'm going to try to edit out as much as I possibly can, but there were sirens, jackhammers, saws.
I didn't hear any of it from my side.
I'm glad. I know the microphone picked it up because I could see it on the meters. Yeah. So I will try to edit it out.
I guess that's the unconscious, like trying to break in.
Exactly. Right?
Yeah. But and so it goes, right? The unconscious is always interfering a little bit with our ego dialogues.
Thank you again for joining us today, Dr. Escamilla.
Thank you.
Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed in this crazy episode. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. Speaking of Jung is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music. And it will be available later in the week on our YouTube channel, Jungian Laura. You can also listen to this episode on your Amazon Echo device simply by saying, "Alexa, play Speaking of Jung on Apple Podcasts. Just be sure to pronounce Jung with a hard J. Links to Amazon's new Echo devices, which are now on sale, can be found in the show notes. So with special thanks to Alexis O'Brien at the Taylor and Francis Group, to Robert Hinshaw of Diamond Furlog, and to Frank N. McMillan III. This is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.